All right, welcome to the randInt podcast with Raffy and Chandra. Hooray! And what was the byline again, which I forgot? This is the podcast that explores how the random affects the everyday.
That sounds clever.
We
like
even cut out a segment because it didn't fit with the theme now. This is getting too pro.
It was not random enough.
All right, so this is a regular episode. So it's got a few different segments, but we'll try to actually condense it instead of rambling like usual.
And if you missed the rambling, do let us know.
Yeah. Actually, does your sister have any recent feedback? Because she used to love the rambling.
Yeah, she still prefers the long rambling episodes.
Does anyone else prefer it? Although I got to say, so feedback from the last one, you know, I think we have to have a regular segment called Being Brown because people loved brown parent stories.
Interesting.
Yeah.
All right.
So the number of people who messaged on social media or commented about, the ID in the car story, they were like, any more? And I gave them a list and they were literally laughing at the titles that I gave them.
Well, I guess it's something people can relate to or are interested in, one of the two.
Yeah, well, I mean, they weren't all brown people that commented. So I think it's a generally, I don't know, or maybe next mini-sode we can have another one. Being Brown Mike 2.
Maybe that can also be a theme for any guests that come up.
Yep. Actually, so this was the other thing. So I was just literally chatting to the person who runs the Doctors of Instagram Instagram page.
Yeah.
And she was saying that, so she's a psych reg. I've never met her in person. And she's going to be doing a series during her psychology masters or something. She was looking into conspiracy theories. And I was like, that would be a perfect segment because it is kind of random, right? But if you think about conspiracy theories, they have a disproportionate impact on your everyday because like the anti-vaxxers, like the thing, there's like this, there might be, I don't know, the loud majority or the light minority, sorry. But there's a decent amount of effort spent on catering or trying to convince those people that are that have non-mainstream views, but they disproportionately command a lot of attention. So I thought, yeah, well, once she does her little summary posts, etc., I'll research it a bit, and we could have this as one of the podcasts for the mini-sode of the next regular one. But also, she's agreed to be a guest. So we can actually interview someone that neither of us know.
There you go. That'll be exciting and new. Uncharted territory.
So yeah, that could be an upcoming one. So we could have Sarah as a guest. But anyway, before we start rambling too far, segment 1. Since you wrote this whole pro forma out, you can lead the show.
All right. Well, it sounds like you've had a bit of time on your hands to talk to people. So why don't you tell us a little bit about what you've been up to?
Okay. So for how are you? So I have been on a week off, or 6 days off. This has been the longest stretch of days off since 2019. So it's been ridiculously good. Last week, even on Monday, because I worked Monday and then basically had the rest of the time off, and this is the Sunday now. I just found that I must have been getting slightly cranky at work without realizing it, because there's a couple of times where, you know how if you tell someone off, they kind of have that sort of sheepish, oh, I'm sorry, kind of vibes about them. One of my assistants was giving me those vibes, and I was like, I didn't even need to be cranky. Am I just now become so dickish that I'm inadvertently kind of telling people off without even realizing? And I think I must have. It was all good by the end, kind of half apologized. Now, I didn't even know what I actually did, if I did do anything, but I was kind of like, by the end of the list, we were kind of back to square one and it was all good. But I think I've just generally been crankier, and just 6 days of sleeping in and not having an alarm, and I feel like 100% better. Unlike other holidays where I used to feel like, yeah, cool, I'm ready to get back to work. I'm still not quite there, even though I'm going back to work tomorrow. But that's okay. Like, I feel like I could stretch this out until we come out of lockdown, or at least get enough vaccinations done that we are allowed to travel again, or at least get out of the 5K radius. In Melbourne currently, because this is we're trying to get ahead and record before we're actually due to release a podcast. So this is the 22nd of August today. So we're recording probably a week before you're listening to it. So we're still in the middle of lockdowns. We had massive protests, like the biggest protests in Victoria since like the 1980s or something, about the lockdowns. I'm like, here we go, another super spreading event. But the positive thing has been that because of all the lockdowns, the silver lining is that the vaccination rates are slowly climbing up. So New South Wales is currently at like 130,000 a day. It's like ridiculously good. And we're about half, or just under half, so just over that 70 something thousand. And considering that everyone's announcing that at 70 and 80% vaccination rates, we might not have lockdowns, I'm like, sweet. So I was currently pessimistic because it's beautiful days outside and in lockdown. But anyway, silver linings, maybe a couple more months of this. Yeah, what have you been up to? You're in somewhere also amazing.
Yeah, so I've actually just come down to Albany at the moment, where I'm doing the locum down here for a week. So basically,
looks like a terrible part of the world.
Yeah, well, it's really rough. There's definitely not amazing views over the beach and sunsets here. And yeah, it's interesting because I'll be covering for somebody who was the year above me in training. So he's sort of, moving down here and doing more work here. And I'm just sort of covering him while he's taking a bit of time off. But yeah, it'll be interesting to cover for somebody that, it's kind of like a friend, really. So yeah, looking forward to seeing how that is.
How is it different to your other gig at the moment in Bunbury?
Very similar overall in terms of, practice and things, but this place is somewhat newer and so being set up in a sense. So everything's a little bit different, and some things are still being worked out. So it's kind of fun as well to be able to be there at the start to see, oh, hey, this, be able to provide some feedback. Oh, this bit's work. Oh, maybe try this bit differently. But then also it's kind of just that mindset's a little bit different. It's like, oh, just covering for a friend. It's like, oh, yeah.
Like, as in, it feels more.
Have you ever done sort of, cover for somebody that you know versus some that is a good friend?
It doesn't quite work like that in anesthetics, because it's not like it's like you can cover for a friend, but it's always this, because you might not know the surgeon. So it's always true. Whereas if you've worked in a regular list for years and years, that's kind of like working with a friend all the time. So everyone kind of
for us, it's kind of when you are covering for somebody, you're essentially, looking after their patients for them. So it's not that you're sort of in and out. You want to make sure that their patients are well looked after as well, no matter who they're from. But it's just a little different working with a friend's place.
Yeah, fair enough. No, I think it's when you're covering a friend's list for anesthetics anyway, it's whilst you try to do a good job, it always feels foreign because you've never usually worked with the surgeon, unless it's the same surgeon who works with, like our friend Guyan, for example. So a few of our friends who are anesthetists work with him. So if we were ever covering one another, it doesn't make any difference because we all work with him and we've all known him since med school. Whereas if it's one of my other lists that isn't a med school friend, say Bash, who's another orthopod, I think Tuan, one of our other friends, ended up covering him once. But I told him everything about it, and this is how I run the show. But I know it was kind of awkward for them both because I heard it from both sides. And even the assistant, who's
actually also is kind of interesting for me, like having finished up training. It's like, oh yeah, most of friends are now kind of on the other side of training. So from a medical sense, it's like, oh yeah, we've all sort of transitioned over.
Yeah. So okay. So you're enjoying it, or when did you get to Albany?
So just got here yesterday, and it was interesting. That was the first long drive I've done in the Tesla.
How did you find it?
It was it was good and bad. So it was great because on the freeways and stuff, just put it on auto steer, auto drive, and it kind of just did its thing pretty much the whole way, speeding up, slowing down by itself, which was great. But I feel like I got a bit jibbed on the battery life aspect of things. It may have been a bit of a me thing because the road on the way there was a somewhat fun road for the first half. I may have been having a little bit too much fun. So I was supposed to get there with 20% left, but got here with about 8% battery left, which was like, it's like 50 Ks here or there. Like, cutting it a little fine.
Nah, like 8% is fine. Like the thing with it is that with the estimates will get better with time because there's like a little energy graph. I'm not sure if it's still there or they're taking it off. I think the next update they're taking it off.
Yeah, they've got the energy graph there. So the good thing is with the self-driving, I had a bit more time to. Otherwise, I was like, if you're driving yourself, you probably shouldn't be looking at this graph too carefully.
Yeah, so that graph actually improves over time once it figures out your driving style, because it basically analyzes that. So yeah, if you just kind of got your Model 3, it'll take a little while before it gives you an accurate one. But yeah, like fun driving definitely shortens it. But I thought you were going to say, because I got to say, I've done a few now, but every long drive I do, I feel like I'm not driving, like I'm supervising the car doing its driving with a little oi.
Yeah, definitely. Once you're on the freeway, it's just like, I tried on the twisty bits to use the auto steering, obviously with close supervision. But yeah, definitely does take the fun out of it.
Well, it does. I think I was telling you last time. It's what scares me in terms of the actual driving is that most of the time it's so good, so that even if you're supervising, you don't like. Even on the twisty bits, it slows down enough. It does.
I think you kind of get a bit tempted to, I'll just change the song now, and you're like, oh wait, hang on. Well,
the thing with it is that it's so good that you kind of like sometimes I hold on and I'm like, should I intervene or is it going to? And it's like cutting it a bit fine, and is it gonna stop now? It's because it's so good, you don't know when the intervention line is. And
also in little things like the gravel on the side of the road, versus good in the center. So normally I'd drive a little bit closer to the center of the road. But it just holds it right in the middle of the lane where technically it is safe. But, I'd be like, maybe a bit more this way.
Yeah, well, and this is also true when you're driving and there's like a big truck. Because like psychologically, massive truck on your side, you just shift a bit over, so you're further away. But because it holds right onto the lane, every time I autopilot and it's right against, it always freaks me out a bit because occasionally you do see the trucks that'll veer right onto the line, and it just cuts down the amount of space between you and them quite significantly. This is more city driving, like going across the Westgate where there's a lot of trucks. This happens quite a bit, so I tend to take over. And also the lane markings are weirdly, it seems to have figured it out now, but it looks continuous with just very tiny gaps, so you can't actually auto steer very well. Like it won't merge. It seems to have now figured out that these are crossable lines because now even though the actual lines haven't changed and they look continuous, the car, either through just noticing that everyone seems to merge left and right anyway, now autopilot will take you across.
Well, I was surprised how well it sort of picked out the lane in the road because where I'm staying at the moment, to get here, it was a little bit of a sort of not a gravel track, but like a compacted road, but there was no road sort of lines painted on it at all. There was just not even like the white markers, just a few of these little orange markers every, so often, not very often at all, and not that even, to be honest, and only really on the one side of the road most of the time. But it still managed to pick the left-hand side of the road, draw the lines, and follow it really well.
Well, so here's the thing, right? So two things. So someone wrote an article who has like the other comparable autopilot system is like the Mercedes ADAS one. And people were saying that one ridiculously good, and it can do level 2+. So there's like levels of autonomy. And I think Tesla's still classified as level 1 or level 2. And this is meant to be the next step up, where I think in specific highways, you're allowed to take your hands off and not pay attention. And basically, they've got a high-res map, it'll do all the stuff. So you can give responsibility to the car. So they've been raving about it for the last, I think it's only come out like 2-3 months ago. And so one guy went and got a car with it, or the slightly older version, I can't remember. And he has both like a Tesla and that. And what he found was that even on the more specified roads, if there was any interruptions or any construction work, then it would totally try to zigzag because it couldn't read the lines properly. Whereas the Tesla system seems to be better at taking markings and whatnot and guesstimating where it's meant to be. So if it's in unfamiliar roads, it does much, much better than the opposite system, which relies that everything will be demarcated. So it's like a different, like, it kind of makes sense. They've trained their algorithm with uncertainty. This one is trained only on certainty. So it performs really well.
One of the things when you're training AI models, basically making it work for the 80% of cases is actually not that hard. And you can optimize so it works really well on those 80% of cases. But the hard part is making it work on that, 0.01% of cases, like roads that don't have any lane markings or construction zones, which are all different. And that's the really hard part. And that's where you've got to collect heaps and heaps of data to make that even close to possible.
So for you should, I sat through the Tesla AI Day talk recently, and it's very, very hard, nerdy. Like, it wasn't really geared at the everyday. Eventually, we kind of realized that it was just like a marketing segment to try and employ more people into their AI systems research.
Nice.
Because it just was so technical. I was like, I kind of get it because I very like hearing you dabble in it. I kind of go like, I think this is what you were talking about, etc. So everything from the chips to how they're trained. But one of the things that was really interesting is how they designed the autopilot system itself. So they initially were like, let's look at all the images and analyze them. But they realized that if they did it that way, the lane markings were never accurate. So they basically this hybrid view that they call vector space, which then marks out the lines in this weird hybrid 3D view. And that seems to increase their accuracy. But as a result, they can also pick out random details like curb or like the line paintings. And from that, it will intuit where the actual lines are. And one of the interesting demos they had was this 2D top-down, like looks like Grand Theft Auto, right? So the car's driving around and it's drawing a map with all the intersections, and you can see where it's predicting there should be a curve, and as it gets closer, it redraws it as a road or a roundabout or whatever. So it's analyzing and drawing its version of a map as you're driving around, versus just looking at pictures and going label, which is I think what some of the other ones do.
No, that makes sense, because if you can predict what's expected and refine as you go, that's kind of what intuitively what we do too. It's like I've been through every intersection and it's a straight line through. I'm guessing the next one kind of looks like that too. Let me make adjustments if needed.
Yeah. But anyway, on that note, that's the other thing I've been up to is programming. This entire holidays I've spent sitting in front and trying to learn Python. It's been a bit slow going, but I'm now getting to the point where, because I think you suggested just like get a project, figure it out, and then submit. But this one, because I have to email other doctors and it involves like taking data and modifying it first, I thought, you know what? Why don't I just do it properly and step by step, and then learn how to do a function, how to do this, etc. So there's a lot of stuff that after doing a bit of Flutter, I was like, this coding challenge isn't much of a challenge because I've done it before in another language. So it's weird that a week spent in another language translates so easily into another, like a different programming language as well. But this was the first time, like yesterday, I had to, there's like this thing called Reborg World. It's basically little coding challenges. So it's like a little bot and you have to make it jump across a hurdle, for example. And then the hurdles become random, the heights and spacing. So then you have to then have like a call function which says, is there a wall in front? Yes. Then turn around and start jumping, but keep checking if there's a wall, and then otherwise turn the corner and come back down. And so you write the program, you hit play, and you just see it do it over and over again into random worlds, and you're like, wow, that's pretty cool. And the next version of that is there's like those newspaper or like those puzzle book mazes that you have to trace around and find the exit. So it gives you a few hints. It's like if you follow along the right, you'll eventually get there, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a few key positions where you can get into an infinite loop if you just had like a if will turn right, there's like a bit of blank space where you'll get trapped. And it's just trying to troubleshoot through your algorithm of how would you go through and navigate a maze. And it's just like they're very simple algorithms, but they're algorithms nonetheless. And then you basically, and it's done so well because there's just little snippets that, like, check wall in front is just a built-in function. So you don't have to do anything. It just automatically does it for you. But just being able to kind of take the logic pieces and break it down and put it back together so that it solves a problem. And then it's kind of like you're creating the robot's brain. Then you execute the program and you watch this thing go around. You're like, like it's just following. And because it shows you the script on the side and where it's going as it goes through each step, like it just kind of highlights the lines and you're like,
doing it.
Yeah, like it's literally just executing stuff that you've written. That's just, and it was just a very satisfying, it's kind of like, last podcast we were talking about unusually satisfying things. It was just unusually satisfying watching a program run step by step and get to whatever arbitrary goal it was.
There's something nice about it, working with the output and not crashing. And you're like, wow, it happened.
Yeah. And specifically watching it go through step by step and watching it's like, it is just because it's kind of like being able to watch it under the hood and see what it's doing. And you're like, yeah, I built that bit. Like it's simple. It took like 10 minutes or something, but it's just so satisfying going, yeah, that was actually the solution. And it's, I suppose the closest thing is like one of those, I used to love doing maths proofs. Like the first time when calculus, for example, blew my mind the first time I did it. Like going, what? You can get areas under curves by just doing this. Like for whatever reason, doing the proof of that is like, I still remember it as one of the most satisfying things I'd done in maths. Like,
I didn't like proofs.
Huh?
I didn't like proofs that required thinking.
No, the proofs, like, because the thing is, I knew if I did the proof and I got the proof, then I would never have to do it again. It's kind of like, show me that it works once and then I'm satisfied. Like then I'll take the shortcuts. And the calculus one just blew my mind just because I just remember it was the Queensland maths textbook basically had a curve and you broke it up into little rectangles, and then you basically got closer and closer. And then basically it went the next step, which is like, all right, what if you had infinity levels? And then it went and did the next step. Like it was like a very long proof. But once it worked, I was like, it just blew my mind. And I was like, yeah, you could see how this is a building block, like a fundamental building block of anything real world, like be it rocket science or whatever, because everything you deal with is some sort of curve rather than a straight line. And they figured out the maths, and this is the progress of how someone went about figuring it out. So coding was kind of like the same because it went through step by step and it showed you which of the code was running. You kind of went, yeah, like here's the proof that my thing works as it's working.
The nice thing about programming in general is it's just an exercise in explicitly stating what you want done. And being able to succinctly describe what it is you want in a variety of circumstances, what you expect to come in and what you expect to come out. And so that translates to a whole bunch of things, which is kind of like can you take something, break it down into a whole bunch of little repeatable steps, create something that explicitly writes that out. And all you're doing in programming is just using a specific language to do that, to tell the computer what to do. So I think it's like a very translatable skill for just a whole bunch of other things and an approach to thinking. I think that's why I like programming quite a bit. If anybody's interested,
I didn't kind of think of it that way, but I can see it's only been like a few days of programming. We're like back to being programming in solid sort of steps, but it's like the next challenge is there's like a Udemy course that I'm doing. It's like the same one that did the Flutter course that I was doing before. So the next one is creating a hangman little Python script so that you play hangman with like a random word. And the really good thing I like about she's a NHS doctor, Angela Yu, who does this, and it's called London App Brewery. I'll link the course, etc., in the show notes, sort of thing. But the way she does all the programming stuff is like you'll get one tiny bit of a challenge, and you figure that out. Then the next bit, then the next bit. So it's kind of like a game. You feel like you're leveling up. Like even on a single day's challenge, it'll be like, here's try this little tiny thing. And you go, oh yeah, the logic of that is easy. And the next bit, and those are the building blocks. And then you put it together into one. And then like, by the end of it, you just realize that your if-else statements that make the logic work is actually pretty complicated. But because you did it in these little chunks, like she's gone to the trouble of finding a thing and breaking it down for you, it always feels like that computer game thing of like, if I just do a tiny bit more, then I might be able to do it, and you get that little bit of positive reinforcement. It's like literally collecting hearts or coins or Super Mario or whatever. It's very gamified, and it's actually I would say it's really fun because it's just.
I'd say the other thing though is I found with those sort of course sort of things, they're really good when you're just starting out and working out how to even break down the problem into multiple bits. But as you move on from that and start making your own stuff for your own purpose, that'll really take your learning to the next level, because then you have to work out, what are the bits? How do I roughly break this down? And because the answer is all there on Google, somebody has, got an answer for whatever bit that you need done.
Yeah. Interestingly, this course specifically, instead of going, here's the bit, goes, you should go and Google, and then it'll tell you like there's a few shortcuts, like you can't use these shortcuts. And it specifically goes into how to look for the answer and where you should look and how to type it out.
That's probably one of the most important things is, especially when you're learning, I found there's a whole bunch of sample code out there for various things. Like if you needed a date converted in a particular format so you could subtract 2 dates or something like that.
Yeah.
Things like that. Even if it's not the main part of your program, if you work out, that's a chunk of thing I need to do, you can go work out how to learn how to do that.
Yeah. Anyway, before getting into too nerdy weeds that no one else cares about, let's move on.
But everybody wants to program, right?
Yeah. I can see everyone yawning right now. If you're yawning, leave us a message about how you're yawning.
Preferably a voicemail with a yawn, I guess. So
yeah, I could use it. Come on, people. Just one voicemail. Is it that hard?
It'll happen eventually.
All right. Should we go to your segment 1, which is
yeah. Well, let's
one
of the things that I've been recently listening to is a book, and thought we'd chat about something that you've either been reading or learning about recently. And for me, one of the books that I've been reading is called Thinking in Bets. I have to find out who the author was. I'll add it to the links. But basically is a poker player, and dealt with the fact that how poker is different with chess, and how that sort of translates more into general life decisions as well.
It's by Annie Duke. I just looked it up.
Thank you, Annie Duke. So her whole thing was like, for example, in chess, all the outcomes are known. You can theoretically calculate what should be done as the next move. There's a finite amount. All of the information is there readily available on the table. Whereas in a game like poker, there's a lot of unknowns. You don't know what the other player's cards are. You don't know what strategy they are following. And you don't know what the next cards that are going to come out on the table are. So there's a lot of unknowns. And that's much more similar to decision-making in life, where you might have a few pieces of the information, but you don't have all the pieces. But at the end of the day, you've still got to make a decision on what to do. And I think one of the things that I took away from that was being able to assign kind of a confidence to whatever decisions or that you make. Because certain decisions, you have a lot of information available to you, and you can be somewhat confident in, okay, I've got most of the information. But by identifying which decisions where you do or don't have the relevant information, that itself can influence your decision making. So for example, if you feel like it's a very unknown kind of decision that you got to make, maybe you'll play it a bit more conservatively.
Yes, it's interesting you've put this out, because the counter has actually been shown to be false. Like what you're saying has been shown to be false in actually a wide range of circumstances. So one of the classic studies that was done in finance was basically getting, I don't know, 3 pieces of info about a stock price, right? Like could be the stock's like price to earnings ratio or profit margin, whatever it is, right? So you take these random numbers, and then you make like derivative values. So it's like this number divided by that number. It's the exact same stuff, right? It's just in a different way. So instead of 3 bits of info, you have like 10 or 12. So the more bits of info you have, it increases people's relative perception of certainty, so that they would take stronger and worse bets. So same pieces of information known to be derivatives actually produce worse outcomes. So I don't think it's necessarily true that you can't. So the number of variables that you have is inversely correlated to your actual confidence, but positively correlated to how confident you think you are.
But that comes back then to the analyzing of the information itself. So
which has a fallacy built in.
If you recognize that actually those are all just derivative information, so you don't actually have any more information, you shouldn't be any more confident in that decision, because
but
you haven't actually gotten any more information.
The point of the study is not so much that, the point of the study was to show that you can tell people exactly this, but people will behave in a way that goes counter. Like you're basically saying, I would like to be a robot that tries to undo that bit, right? But in a generalized population, you could be different. It doesn't work. Is what like multiple
but it doesn't have to work in a general population for it to still be useful, though. Because yes, if you give people multiple derivatives of the same information, they'll feel wrongly more confident about that same decision.
That's why vaccines don't work, okay? Just because it works the population,
exactly.
It has to work
if
with
you
me.
ask Biden about it.
No, I'm
but
special.
Still, at the end of the day,
you
can actually, but if you can verify that information for yourself, and that's what is up to you to be able to work out and pass through lots of information to work out, is this actually more information or is this just more noise? It can impact, and it probably should. And on the flip side of that, though, is also being comfortable with the fact that you'll make decisions with bad outcomes, but you should probably make the same decision again. Because if at the end of the day, you had all the information available to you and that was the best decision to make, if you make that decision and it doesn't turn out the way it should, sometimes it's tempting to go, oh, damn, I shouldn't have done that. But actually, it's more important to also think about, rather than looking at what the outcome was, what was the decision-making process you went through? So, for example...
It's pretty abstract. Do you have any concrete examples?
Yeah, so actually in the book, they give the example in poker playing. So a simple one is, you've got 4 cards on the table. There's one more card that's due to come out. Based on the cards that you have, you can actually calculate somewhat of a probability of what's going to come on the other side. So you might have cards which mean that based on the cards you have and the cards that are on the table, you have an 80% chance of winning. And so you might bet big because, there's a good chance you're going to win this one. But it's important to know that there is still a 20% chance that you're going to lose, even though the best decision at the time was to bet big. And so the next time you come to that same situation, you shouldn't then be put off by that and say, oh, actually, I should bet small this time because last time it didn't work out so well. So that's one of the ways to look at it. And certain things, it might only be a 30 for, it's more, in favor of going your way, 60, 70% chance your way kind of thing. But 40% things do happen fairly often by definition. And so you don't need to necessarily change your decision. Things like Trump winning the election.
Well, actually, this was like, this kind of brings up another one, which was one of like Nassim Taleb's quotes that I absolutely loved, which was, the same piece of information can be interpreted in 2 completely opposite ways, depending on perspective. They're both depending on how you are viewing it and extrapolating it can be correct. It's like, and the example was a Christmas turkey, and the Christmas turkey wakes up, gets fed every day, and has it like walks around and then sits down and goes to sleep and repeats. So based on the turkey's experience, it's immortal. It wakes up, it eats, it's fed, it's comfortable, it doesn't get hunted, da 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 da. So it thinks that it has an infinite number of days to live. Whereas if you're looking at it from the point of view as the butcher, it's like each day closer is like they've got limited lifespan. So the same piece of info, which is you are getting fed and you're waking up, it leads to two totally different extrapolations based on what your perspective is.
Interesting. That book sort of brought this up as well, where I'm trying to think of the exact example, but basically they gave people some facts on something fairly. This was sort of, yeah, that's right, actually. It was bringing up the example about personal biases and how they can be stronger the more perceived educated you are. So they gave two examples. The first one was they gave a whole bunch of people some information about a skincare product. And yeah, it just, does this work or not? Something fairly neutral. And half the people, they gave one set of information, half the people, they gave another set of information, and people sort of defined themselves as, well-educated or not. And overall, the people that were, well-educated make reasonable arguments that you would expect based on the data that they were given. Because some of the people were given data to say that it was good, some of the people were given data to say it's bad. And so people made the expected decisions. But then they flipped it over to do guns cause violence? And then what they found is the people that, self-nominated as well-educated were much, much more likely to manipulate the data or interpret it in a way that fits in with their view. So they also asked, before, like, were they liberal or whatever? Yeah. And what they found was they were much, much more likely to misinterpret that because they just gave them fake made-up data, which might have actually supported the opposite conclusion and just told them specifically, based on this data only, what is your arguments?
Yeah, fair enough. Well, I mean, it kind of seems to be the right-wing media. Like, I mean, as a more of a lefty, that's what I would say, right? But it's kind of like you look at like COVID deaths, and back in actually, I was just talking to someone about this literally before we jumped on. Was you remember how it was just the flu? It was just the flu, and when we had like 700 cases in Victoria, and there's like, I think we still have the highest number of deaths, right? Mm. And people are like, see, it's just like the flu. It's like, if 700 cases equal a few hundred dead, that is not the flu. 700 peaks, a few thousand positives. But right now, New South Wales has a higher like daily count. It's like 800 something plus. So their total numbers are reaching what Victoria hit, right? And the deaths are like 3, 5. And no one
wasn't it like 40s or something before in Melbourne? I thought it was like 40 a day or something in Melbourne, wasn't it?
It's currently 60 a day in Melbourne versus...
No, I mean deaths a day when Melbourne was at the peak.
Yeah, I can't remember, but it was getting high, right? Like I think we still had like a few hundred, like 1,000 people died during that that wave. The same number of cases. In fact, the New South Wales trajectory, even during a lockdown, is faster than Melbourne was growing. Or I don't know if it's actually faster, but the case numbers are, it's not as steep because they were in partial lockdowns. So it's a bit gentler, but the case numbers are rising, and it's because it's like kind of exponential. It's not quite exponential. The totals, I think, are getting to almost Victoria during that really deadly wave. But the actual number of deaths is like a fraction, like 3%, like 3 in a day, 2 in a day, et cetera, et cetera. But no one's pointing out, it's like, well, what's the biggest difference? People are now vaccinated, and no one kind of seems to be highlighting the fact that, everyone's going clots and this and that. It's like, yeah, but look at the tenfold difference in mortality. And
the good thing is, I mean, not ideal, obviously, but because it's front and center of mind for everybody now, everyone's very keen to get a vaccine, which is interesting.
Because are still vaccine side effects, right? And you're like, look at the tenfold X in mortality, not just like, you're not just going to get a clot, because even if you get a clot, the treatment regimes change, so the mortality from the clot is even lower, right? But it's still, and there's still people like, the people, there's people that I work with, and there's people who are like building stuff here that refuse to get the vaccine based on those two things. And I was like, there are legitimate reasons, like you could be allergic to stuff, and at the end of the day, it's your choice, it's your body. But if you're going to use those numbers, it's literally what you're saying about twisting the numbers the opposite way. It's like, blows my mind that you can't, like, if that proof was true, then don't cross a road. You're suggesting that the probability of dying from crossing a road is too high, so you should never cross a road.
Well, I think it comes back to that whole thing of you can manipulate data to whatever end you want.
All right, fair enough. I'll have to have a look at that book. I took a little break from nonfiction lately because I've been reading.
I think the big takeaway anyway from me was to any decisions, I suppose, consciously think about the uncertainty in the information available. So that's probably my key takeaway.
Fair enough. Yeah, I think I'll need to actually read the book to kind of come up with a more informed version of how to do that. I'm not sure if it's going to be any different to standard medical practice, really, because everything, including your results and whatnot, comes with that degree of, that number could be wrong. It's a number of times you look at that and you're like, clearly doesn't fit the rest of it. It's probably wrong. Let's rerun the test. But it's that. But, said another way. So I would suggest, what was I going to say? Yeah, I was going to actually talk about a different book about a guy called David Deutsch, who wrote this thing called Beginning of Infinity, which talks about what I thought was going to be a very boring book. And I didn't quite understand why so many people, like there's a podcast on it by a guy called Naval. And it's probably a good starting point because it's like about 40 minutes to an hour long and just talks about the key themes. And that's probably all you need. But the book is actually really well written about a topic that I genuinely could not get excited about for the first few chapters. I just kind of pushed through, and by the end of it, I was like, damn, this is really good. And it talks about the knowledge of knowledge, like if you break down the fact that in modern day, like COVID, right? COVID happened and there's research, and even the people who are in the anti-vax camp go, well, the vaccine was rushed, right? That should be studied more. But there's an assumption right there that you can study it more, that your knowledge will grow. And this was not the case for most of human history. And I was like, that one thing blew my mind, because what his thing was like, it's like, let's say you were back in Roman times or Greek times, right? For the Enlightenment period, why was there a plague? Because the gods willed it. You can't do anything about that. You can't make something. You can't analyze something. You have no control. The most you can do is pray, right? And they have to accept your prayer, but that's not under any preconditions to what you actually do. It's up to them, right? So it's totally outside your control. And there is no point in trying to acquire more knowledge because it's fundamentally nothing you can do about it, right? So like that tiny...
That's interesting though, because sometimes those religious stories have a lot of knowledge, and they themselves are a store of knowledge.
They are, right? Like, as in, they try to convey
like,
more values.
Don't kill people because, it turns out that's not good for running a society. We work that bit out.
Well, I mean, they also get twisted, right? Like, it's like the whole... like my current gripe, which has been going on for a while, is like the whole thing with Islam being a backward anti-knowledge thing. It's like literally one of the very first commandments is read or learn. It's like, it was when it was like the Quran was revealed, literally the first thing was like read or learn. I can't remember the
but only very specific Facebook groups.
But anyway, things get twisted. But I just found like the argument that he made, which was the entire point of trying wasn't there for most of human history, and everything we've had so far is kind of like this thing that happened during the Enlightenment phase, where people actually went, hang on, we should question our knowledge. Because on the other thing you were saying is kind of like your probability on any given bit was if you were of that ilk that was like, the divine, the priest had all the knowledge, they couldn't be wrong. There was no probability to assign. They were right. And if they were ever wrong, you could change the back slightly, right? So it didn't necessarily need any tweaking. It didn't need probability weighting. Like, it was inaccurate, but you could always change the story. And so,
it was 100% correct.
Yeah. So, and the other thing that I got out of it was, how like in research there's type 1 error and stuff, and it's like rejecting the null hypothesis when it's true, and it's meant to be this bad thing, right? Like, it's always, you try to avoid it. And his was the first explanation of why that makes any sense. Like, it was just like a random thing that fit in my head after it. And it was basically saying, in any research or any sort of scientific sort of inquiry, or any inquiry in general, you should be basically making a bet. But like playing pool, you should be calling the hole that you're going to sink the ball, because only then, if it's something new and you can predict it with that degree of accuracy, can you say, hey, I think I've got something here. Otherwise, generally speaking, whatever you knew before was probably right? Like, because someone else has called that and proven it in that fashion. So if they can do it, if they can call the shot before they make it and sink it, right? You have to disprove by an equivalently high standard. And that's the whole, like, it didn't describe it in that way, but I was like, damn, so that's the whole type 1 versus type 2 error thing. Like, that's why it's important. And it was a random thing that kind of popped up. But the biggest takeaway from the book that I had, and this one relates to, like, the biggest thing was that I didn't realize memes was a word before memes were a thing, like, like cartoon pictures. So memes supposedly just relate to infectious ideas, right? And the interesting thing part of the book was, this is like last few chapters where it gets really non-scientific because there's not really data for it, but it talks about, like, genetic evolution and how it came about. It's kind of like Sapiens in a way. It talks about, like, different people try different things, and natural. One of the core tenets is nature seems to go through variation. So it'll just recombine different things, and then selection then apply. Well, it doesn't do it, but the environment just, applies a selective pressure, and the things that survive get to reproduce and pass on the genes. One of the things was, ever since language, you've been able to transmit ideas, and ideas will then replicate, because that's what, like, the anti-vaxxer movement, this is like fascism, pick whatever you want, like religion. They're ideas that are infectious, that transmit, that also cause replication, right? So it's like a yawn. If I yawn, you yawn. That's like this biological one where there's this mimicry going on, right? And the other thing you were saying is, like, though the ideas transmit and replicate, they never replicate 100% because there's variations both in muscle structure, this, that, interpretation of the things. And one of the quotes he uses is like, there is nothing that can be said that can be said so well that it can't be reinterpreted, right? There is always this little bit of remixing, right? So the ideas actually go through non-natural selection. And it's the combination of ideas that actually gives rise to, where does the hypothesis come from? Like, where do you come up with a new idea? And it's like this remixing of these little memes over time, which then some are tested, some are really interesting, but they're not replicated, so they just die out, right? Like, it's like building a pyramid. How the ancient Egyptians did that kind of just, after a while, got lost. Like, we've got theories on how they did it, but there's no, like, they had papyrus, they had scrolls, but they haven't really written down how they built a pyramid. So, like, historians have to go and kind of figure it out, like going, oh, they had sand pits, that's probably how they did it, right? But they never bothered to write down the idea.
Yeah.
So it was a really interesting, it was a dense technical book, but it had like a lot of interesting ideas of how, like, just facets of the modern day that I'd never really considered.
Any sort of takeaways or things that you might do differently? Or more just sort of raises some interesting...
I've talked about like a few different points of the book, but the book is called Beginning of Infinity. And it talks about how at any, like, you shouldn't take a nihilistic view of the future, because at every point people thought they'd discovered everything. And it turns out there's an infinitely more amount of things to discover. And what his thing was saying is like, look, as long as you are not, as long as you're limited by something, right? Be it time, mortality, like, resources, whatever, there will, like, your best understanding will come with the best, what you were saying, with the best available data of the time, expect it to be rewritten and revised. But it's not like, it doesn't strike a sour tone of like, oh, you'll never know everything. It's like, you don't need to know everything. In fact, at any given time, as time progresses, as long as the concepts of being able to criticize an idea and move forward and try out new things continues, you can be hopeful that whatever the next period brings, though it may be rapid change, and that's always kind of unpleasant, it should be technically better than where you were. And the thing that I would end this video is like about a month ago, we were in the tea room before this outbreak and everything. And we were talking about vaccines, and one of the other work colleagues was like, oh, the Australian government done a terrible thing. We should have had more variety in terms of, instead of just settling on two. And I was just saying, look, whatever the landscape's like, I'm glad the pandemic happened now and not 10 years ago. And she was saying, well, what would be different? I'm like, think about it. We have Zoom. We didn't have Zoom then. We have mRNA technology that we got a vaccine. Like think about the argument. We should have had a wider variety of vaccines. Man, we didn't have the tech.
Yeah, let's start with, we've got one.
We would have had one, and that's all you could have had, not 5 different ones that we're arguing about which one's better. We would have had one, and that would be it, right? And then we wouldn't have like QR codes. Like we had QR codes, but it wasn't widely adopted. Like being able to check in, like everyone was arguing, was like apps. Like App Store basically came out 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago. Like the mobile phones wouldn't have had the capabilities. Just imagine how different the pandemic would be if it just had happened 10 years prior. Like when SARS happened, we never really got it here, but that was like a disaster in other parts of the world, right? And they were prepared because they'd gone through that, but it was a totally different experience now. Like everyone's like, oh, mental health, da, da, da. It's like, yeah, but you can at least still communicate. FaceTime is so widely ubiquitous, or some form of it, that you can communicate, right? This telehealth, like.
It's interesting to see how far backwards you'd have to go in time where these sort of global pandemics are also then not possible, or even less likely to happen, because there's a lot less, for example, global travel. So even if you did get
this would be
pre-pandemic,
it
wouldn't be such a problem.
Well, pre-1920s then, because the Spanish flu, it was still, because the thing is, we kind of think of the rate of transfer is probably faster because of planes, but ship transfer and ship breeding grounds meant that you got like a vector that was, everyone would have had the disease. Like actually part of the thing
kind of like, I guess the Ruby Princess landing every time.
Well, see, the other premise, so this is actually in, I can't remember if it was like at the beginning of Infinity, or I think it was in the beginning of Infinity, but also in a book called Guns, Germs, and Steel. And it talks about how this could be another random segment of how the random affects the everyday. It's like random diseases probably shaped the world in terms of which civilizations won out based on exposure to things. And it's totally random.
That would be a random chance event.
Yeah, it was a random chance event, and there was other there was other civilizations with better technology, but they just died out because they didn't have any immunity to random diseases, and they had better populations. They were further along, but they totally got wiped out because a visitor came and spread a disease that they had no immunity to, and they all kind of died, or they were so screwed that when the next wave came, they were helpless. Anyway, so I'm liking this theme of the show because it's like, it's a nice lens, actually.
How does the random do stuff? Let's pursue this.
All right. Go to random questions. So what's your favorite thing, system, item that's really come in handy for you recently?
Well, this morning it didn't quite work out, but I'll tell you why. But in general, I tend to run life by calendar because I've got so many things going on, from daytime work to then not daytime work as well.
That's not daytime work. It sounds like you're.
As in, well, in St Kilda, no. I meant like before and after work stuff, so startup stuff and other project things.
Yeah.
And so sort of, at least except for that, blissful year of unemployment. Actually, even then it was quite scheduled. Been very dependent on my calendar, and it's just one of those little things that has been such a help. On one hand, it's kind of like a little bit of a crutch because it's like, I can't remember what I'm doing tomorrow. But but it's just enabled so much less thinking about what to do the next day. And now that somebody's helping me,
like you're just saying calendar, like what does it entail?
Sure. So what I do is basically in my calendar have very detailed thing of the time of each event, the location of the event, and then also like who it's with and what it's about. Because sometimes I'll schedule something in 2 or 3 weeks ahead, and that just happened last week. And then when I look at the call, I'm like, who is this and what are we talking about? Because I've already forgotten why. So I found it's a bit of a crutch because I also don't know what I'm doing the next day. And now I've gotten to the next point where somebody's helping me put my calendar together. And so when we tried to organize this podcast thing, I realized that I had added an event myself to today, but because I've kind of stopped doing that, I forgot to add the time zone problems. Hence, we had to make the last minute change. So I'm hoping it's kind of one of those, it's good and bad. It's bad because it means probably I end up scheduling in too many things because it can be done, which then eats into my deep work time or just sitting around taking photos time. But it is also quite helpful in terms of enabling certain things. And a minor thing, the best thing is now when you get in the Tesla, it knows where I'm going next. And so it just starts.
Yeah, it thinks your calendar.
That's really cool.
It's actually saved me a couple of times because I've got our rostering system at work. I specifically asked the developers to do this because it used to come up with like, whatever list I was doing, whether it's ENT or whatever, and then the morning and the afternoon. And I was like, can you please just put in like Western Health or like Royal Melbourne, wherever I'm going into the location thing. It doesn't have to have the address. It just has to have the label. And because Tesla's smart enough to extract that and plot the course, because there are last minute changes. And because it syncs to my phone calendar, it then syncs to the Tesla, where I thought like I'd looked at it the night before, but there'd been a last minute change that I didn't wake up and check again because you just looked at it just before I went to bed. So I was heading to one hospital. I'm like, why is it directing me to the other? And then I looked at the calendar and it had shifted. And like, in fact, I think once I was going to the correct hospital and the secretary rang us and went, oh, hey, you've been shifted. I'm like, Tesla saves me again.
But yeah, that's where the calendaring life can be kind of handy if you've got too many things going on.
Yeah, I have too many things going on, but I'm too slack to use a calendar properly. So I have to take some inspiration. But then again, most of my time is in the 9 to 5. So I can't really, like, it doesn't affect me too much, I suppose, because it's always the after hours stuff. I can do that on my own sort of schedule. I think the biggest, not really a system or anything, has been like having pets around, because I think we just crossed over the 200-day mark in lockdown. And it's weird because after a while, things become so, it's just, you're stuck in a very small box of infinite repeat. So it becomes like, it's not quite mundane. It's not quite Groundhog Days because there's always differences. But having pets and plants, it kind of gives you this sense that time is progressing. It's because things are so similar, the rate of change of time becomes like weird. It feels like everything was just yesterday, but also so long ago. Whereas by having those two things, like pets, I can see like Luna, the cat, is getting a bit bigger and her habits are changing, like what she's comfortable with, not comfortable with, like that changes over time. And you go, you used to like poop in the wrong corner. Now you're doing it correctly. Like these little changes. I suppose this is the same as having kids. Like you watch them change, right? And with plants, you can really see them grow. Like, hey, that leaf wasn't there before.
I feel like some listeners might be slightly upset at you comparing kids to plants, but continue.
Well, like they change. They have visible change. I'm not a parent. I don't know. But it's been weirdly therapeutic. Just it's like, because reality in a closed box is trying to distort your sense of time, having this other constant that changes lets you recalibrate to actual reality. Does that make sense? Yeah, so as annoying as it is that the cats poop and pee,
it's just the same 200th day as the last one.
Yeah. Like, I mean, they'll poop and crap on like random spots or vomit everywhere, but it gives you this variety that kind of makes it feel more tolerable even though, like, at the moment it's currently coming to spring, and like Gary the cat keeps on vomiting because he's shedding. So like literally every vomit you'll find like this giant hairball. I'm like, okay, if that was stuck in your GIT, probably why you're vomiting, right? Then you go, oh, it must be because it's spring, because that's why he's shedding.
Yeah, I'm kind of using the outdoors to mark that. It was raining last week in Bunbury. So, I'm like, it's Western Australia. It's supposed to be sunny the whole time.
Yeah, well, Melbourne like is getting sunny now, but up until like last week, it was Melbourne. So it's very hard to tell.
This is true. Even in summer, it'll still be nice.
Yeah, I think today's nice, and then tomorrow's meant to be back to like rainy and cloudy. So it's like, were we in spring? Cool. Oh, last segment. This one we were going to do something differently, but again, fitting with the show's theme of how random affects the everyday. The segment I wanted was, what's a random habit that seems bad but is actually useful? And I'll give you an example. So yesterday, again, going back to the Python programming thing, so the exercise was, how do you generate? So it was meant to be a password generator. So you type in the number of letters you want, how many numbers you want, and how many symbols you want, and it gives you a randomized password, right? And I solved it in one way, but so let's say you put in 5 letters, 5 numbers, 5 symbols. So you should have a 15-character password. But the program that I built just wasn't doing that. Like every so often it would give you 15, but then the other time it would give you like 8 letters, sometimes like 12. I'm like, but the loop that I created was for 15 letters long. And I just couldn't figure it out. And it had like a randomizer. It actually had the words randInt. So I was like, yes. Anyway, so I kind of like scratched my head for a while, and then like sat down on the couch, and I was like, yeah, like I went over it so many times. And then Luna the cat jumped on my lap, and then because I couldn't move, I fell asleep. And I woke up, and it kind of clicked as to why. And it was just, there's too many random factors in a row that also meant that I got a random length out of it.
So you were maximizing the randomness. Yeah. A little bit too much random for one podcast.
I was like, man, I spent an hour and a half staring at it, could not figure it out, and having a nap fixed it, essentially. Like I literally woke up and I was like, that's the problem. And it reminded me that Dali and Einstein used to use a very similar thing, and Dali specifically used to use it very, very obviously. So what he would do before his, to try and make his sort of abstract surrealist paintings, was he would sit on a chair and hold a key over a metal plate, and then he'd like basically drop off. And as he nodded off, the key would drop from his hand, clang on the plate, and that'd wake him up. But he'd be in that sort of groggy, hypnagogic state, I think. And that's where you're starting to get into your dream state, but you're still awake enough to remember it. And that's where he came up with half his ideas. And supposedly Einstein used to have a similar thing where you would take an idea that you really like, literally probably similar to me, like where you have an idea or a problem and you can't quite solve it, and you're like thinking about it. And basically, there's a book called Why We Sleep by Matt Walker, which talks about the different functions that sleep might have, because it's still kind of under-investigated. But you do get into a mode where the different boundaries you set for yourself, like, you as a doctor versus you as an entrepreneur, as a tech person, there's this, that, they kind of blur, and your random knowledge about this bit and that bit is allowed to collide freely. So you actually get certain insights. It's kind of like the whole, to be the world's best at one thing, there's only one. But if you're the world's best at 5 different things, like there's more people that like that combinatrix thing, right? So it's like you do this nightly. So why not do it with a bit more focus? And Dali, and if it worked for Dali and Einstein, you've got to say it's probably got some benefit. And yesterday was good proof that, it's true. Because like literally I bashed my head against a wall, went and had a nap, and got the solution. Like I was like, how much more of a win-win can you have?
Yeah, it kind of reminds me, I think there's a book called Thinking Slow, Thinking Fast or something along those lines. But that whole thing about just, sometimes if you just stop, walk away, do something else and just leave it in the background, you often come up with a much better answer, or do actually come up with an answer, as opposed to just bashing your head against the wall for a while.
Yeah.
On the sleep thing, that's interesting about that thing about the spoon thing, because that reminds me of when I was looking into lucid dreaming.
Yeah.
Similar sort of thing. It's been a little while since I looked it up, but again, you try to wake yourself
Just
up.
to clarify what lucid dreaming is, lucid dreaming is the state where you're in a dream, but you're aware that you're in a dream, so you can control it. And it is something that can be learned. I used to be able to do it quite frequently, but I've kind of fallen out of the habit. But continue.
But yes, lucid dreaming. So it seemed like an interesting thing to experiment with, which then I got distracted by other stuff because I found then the next day I was a bit sleepy. So I could never quite get it to work consistently. It's on my to-do list for later.
Like when I used to lucid dream, I used to wake up like more refreshed.
No, it doesn't work for me.
Essentially, I was in perma REM for ages.
No, it didn't work for me. But it would be kind of cool to be able to then go practice doing stuff in sleep.
No, because like I think even last night, like thinking back, there was like this period where I woke up because of something. I think I need to pee or something. But I remember going, I think I was half awake, but I wasn't because I was in a dream state and then waking up. And I can't remember. I think it actually was Python related.
So what I'm hearing is your lucid dreaming, you could go flying, you could do whatever you want, but your Python programming. Right.
Yeah, it was anyway. But the thing is, like, I woke up and I was like, I really want to get into the next lesson now.
Well, that's the fun thing of, getting really, really into something new. And I just love learning something new. And that's when you're just like, yes, I'm in, let's do this.
So do you have any random habits that are bad but useful?
Yeah, so I suppose it's somewhat of a similar thing, but I do often end up going on random YouTube rabbit holes of learning about stuff.
Like your lockpicking adventures?
Yeah, lockpicking adventures, sailing videos. But occasionally it's somewhat connected to what I might be doing. And sometimes I'm just, yes. Unfortunately, I don't have my lockpicking gear with me. I got into that for a while. That was actually quite fun. If anybody wants a great lockdown hobby, look into lockpicking. You can get everything you need off Alibaba for $20. It's great.
Like we have random perspex locks and random tools just strewn all over the place. Like, I mean, this guy will, okay. So think about Chandra, right? So somehow I followed him around a few different states in different apartments that he's suspiciously occupied and said, hey, you can take over the lease. He's like, yeah, it's minimally furnished, you don't have to do anything. So then he pisses off and then I have to end the lease and then move out. Then you'll literally always find a room that has boxes and random crap everywhere that he's totally forgotten about. Like the place in Perth, literally it was under the stairs. I didn't even know there was a room, like a little storage cupboard. It was just packed to the brim of stuff that he's accumulated that he's like, see? And you look at the rest of the apartment and it's like sparse. There's like a beanbag and a glass table and that's it. And you're like, wow, really minimalist. Because he's forgotten about all the other stuff that he's essentially hidden in the cupboards.
Yeah, so for anybody who wants to live a minimalist life, my suggestion is have a cupboard to chuck shit in and just move every couple of years. Take the stuff that you really want and you can see, ignore all the rest. It'll take care of it. The world will take care of it for you.
So whilst he's been in WA, like my brother wanted to come and crash in between the lockdowns in his room. And yeah, just to kind of clean out and do the laundry and whatnot. I was doing that and I was like, holy moly. Like, because I walked into the room and it looked pretty clear. I didn't realize that just on the other side of the bed, like the side that's away from the door, just below eye level, is a whole pile of boxes.
That was stuff that was supposed to be sold on Gumtree, but unfortunately had to.
Oh, it wasn't just that. It was random boxes of other crap too.
Oh, really? Oops. Probably on the to-do list. But you can't see it when you kind of, as long as you stay over here, you can't see it. So it looks minimalist. So it's all good.
Yeah, and then when I opened the wardrobe, I was like, here's all the lockpicking gear.
In my defense, I did have to bail pretty quick.
This is true. Coolio. Should we call it that time for this
That
episode?
sounds like a good long
I don't know how long
podcast.
it's been because I have not put a timer on this time. But it sounds like it was pretty long. But anyway,
At the risk of getting too many yawns to our voicemail, let's wrap it up.
All right. Well, I mean, I think your sister will enjoy the more rambly nature of this one.
Indeed. I'll let her know.
As always, like, subscribe, and all that stuff, depending on whichever platform. But leave us a review or any feedback. So it's podcast@photosbyraffy.com. What's episode is this? 14, right?
Yeah, we're getting into
like
it now.
6 away, and then we'll get our own domain and everything. It'll be far more professional. Yes.
It will be shiny.
But at least the audio is better, and we should have better YouTube clips. Oh yeah, on social media there will be like random clips now because I'm slowly starting to figure out how to do those progress bars and subtitles and all that stuff.
Nice.
But yeah, please leave us a voicemail because voicemails are life. And I think there's a couple of people I threatened. If you want more brown people stories, you have to leave a voicemail. Otherwise, we're not doing this.
That sounds like good motivator.
Or if you actually like one of the previous segments that you'd like returned, it's like, hey, look, if you give us feedback, we will actually follow it. Yeah. So until next time, adios.
See ya, and enjoy more randomness. Bye.
Bye. We should. Cool. That works. To the nothing like eating whilst recording randInt again.
I have my tea because intermittent fasting, and also it's just cheaper. There's less stuff to buy.
I'm getting more chewing noises.
As a what?
But I got more chewing noises. Yum, yum,
Yum, yum, yum, yum.